Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Education, SOE, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts in Adult Education, MAEE, Second Year, MAEE 001 Sustainable Development, Block-1 Introduction to Sustainable Development, Unit-2 Sustainable Development, Approaches and Strategies, 2.0 Introduction. You have studied the concept, scope, dimensions and concerns of sustainable development in Unit 1. Hence, you are aware that, though sustainable development has become very popular in the last decades, its concept is complex as it is emerging and encompasses a range of different sectors. According to Andres R. Edwards, 2005, the sustainability revolution paints a picture of this largely unrecognized phenomenon from the point of view of 5 major sectors of society: community, government and times, international institutions; 2, commerce, business; 3, natural resources, forestry, farming, fisheries, etc.; 4, ecological design, architecture, technology, and biosphere, biodiversity, conservation, etc. It makes the approaches and ailes to sustainable development more difficult. Sustainable development calls for different approaches and strategies that can effectively blend economic, social, and ecological approaches in a manner indispensable and complementary to each other so as to meet the needs and requirements of not only the present generation but also leave scope for development of the future generations. In this unit, we will, therefore, attempt to focus on the origin of sustainable development, as well as the approach and strategies followed by the government and other agencies, including the community-based organizations and the individuals, for promoting sustainable development. 2.1 Objectives. After going through this unit, we expect you to be able to trace the origin of sustainable development, describe different approaches to sustainable development, explain the principles and aspects of strategic approach to sustainable development, discuss the challenges to strategy for sustainable development, and analyze the role of government, development agencies, community-based organizations, and individuals in the context of sustainable development. In order to enable you achieve the above objectives, we wish you to go through the following sections thoroughly. 2.2 Origin of Sustainable Development. The concept of sustainable development, in fact, has originated and developed through different phases of environmentalism. Basically, there are 3 phases of environmentalism which are discussed below. Rajrapasin Haroy, 2010. First phase. The environment protection action has been taken by the people of Europe at the time the Industrial Revolution in 17th century, which gave rise to modern environmental pollution as it is generally understood today. The emergence of great factories and consumption of immense quantities of coal and other fossil fuels gave rise to unprecedented air pollution, and the large volume of industrial chemical discharges added to the growing load of untreated human waste. The first modern environmental laws came in the form of the British Alkali Acts, passed in 1863, to regulate the deleterious air pollution, gaseous hydrochloric acid, given off by the Leblanc process, used to produce soda ash. Environmentalism, thus, grew out of the amenity movement, which was a reaction to industrialization, the growth of cities, and worsening air and water pollution. The common people took initiative for the protection of the environment. Second phase, the beginnings of an environmental movement in the United States can be traced as far back as 1739, when Benjamin Franklin and other Philadelphia residents, citing public rights, petitioned the Pennsylvania Assembly to stop waste dumping and remove tanneries from Philadelphia's commercial district. In the US, it was seen that great poets and other literary scholars protested against destruction of the environment through their work. The US movement further expanded in the 1800s out of concerns for protecting the natural resources of the West. with individuals such as John Muir and Henry David Thoreau making key philosophical contributions. Thoreau was interested in people's relationship with nature and studied this by living close to nature in a simple life. He published his experiences in the book, Waldane, which argues that people should become intimately close with nature. Muir came to believe in nature's inherent right, especially after spending time hiking in Yosemite Valley and studying both ecology and geology. With the initiative of common people first to national parks, Yosemite and Yellowstone National Parks were established in the US to save some wildlife. Third phase, later, in 1960s, an incident which turned the whole situation was spraying of DDT in the farms of America. In 1962, Silent Spring was published by American biologist Rachel Carson. The book explained in detail the environmental impacts of the indiscriminate spraying of DDT in the US countryside FLM, which contained large amount of chemicals causing HM to the migratory birds that usually came to have the crops. The book suggested that DDT and other pesticides may cause cancer and that their agricultural use was a threat to wildlife as well as to the human beings. Then, in the 1970s, the Chipko movement was formed in India, influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. They set up peaceful resistance to deforestation by literally hugging trees, leading to the term tree huggers. Their peaceful methods of protest and slogan ecology is permanent economy were very influential. Gradually, with increasing industrialization, globalization and liberalization, and concomitant effects on environment, environmentalism and sustainable development have assumed greater significance. It is significant to note that the Decade 200-5-2014 has been declared as UN Decade QF Education for Sustainable Development, DESD. 2.3 Approaches to Sustainable Development. Sustainable development approaches and programs often encompass a broad range of different types of capital and assets. Therefore, before we touch upon approaches to sustainable development, we will take a brief look at the types of capital and assets. 2.3. 1. Types of capital and assets in sustainable development. Sustainable development programs include a broad range of different types of capital and assets. Though the words capital and asset are often used interchangeably, when discussing these various stores of value, the term capital refers to stores of value that depreciate in value over time, while the term assets refers to stores of value that appreciate over time. Tittenberg, 1996. Capital and assets are any store of value that can provide income, benefits, goods, services, or other things of value. They are typically categorized into the following three types. Eric Larson, 1998. I. Manufactured and financial capital. The most familiar type of capital is made by people and includes all financial assets and physical capital. It includes buildings, highways, pipelines, stock and bond investments, the permanent funds, and any other form of financial or physical asset that we as humans have created or manufactured. 2. Human and social capital. People and communities also have stores of value that can be passed on from one generation to the next. People embody human capital in the form of knowledge, education, skills, training, and other valuable abilities. Communities and societies are stores of social capital in the form of traditions, customs, identity, organizations, laws and institutions that are passed on to future generations as well. 3. Natural capital. It includes all aspects of the natural environment that provide income, services, resources, or benefits. Natural capital includes raw resources, such as mines, oil, timber, fish, etc. It includes life support services such as 5 climate regulation, nutrient cycling, waste treatment, soil formation, and other ecological processes that keep us alive. Natural capital also encompasses hunting, subsistence, and outdoor recreation of resources, as well as aesthetic and cultural benefits derived from nature. The sustainable development debate is based on the assumption that societies need to manage three types of capital: economic, social, and natural, which may be non-substitutable and whose consumption might be irreversible. Dillick and Hawkins. 2002. Dali, 199I, for example, points to the fact that natural capital cannot necessarily be substituted by economic capital. While it is possible that we can find ways to replace some natural resources, it is much more unlikely that they will ever be able to replace ecosystem services such as the protection provided by the ozone layer or the climate stabilizing function of the Amazonian forest. In fact, natural capital, social capital, and economic capital are often complementarities to one matter. A further obstacle to substitutability also lies in the multifunctionality of many natural resources. Forests, for example, not only provide the raw material for paper, which can be substituted quite easily, but also maintain biodiversity, regulate water flow, and absorb http://n.wikipedia. Wiki Sustainable Development Three types of capital in sustainable development. Many people may agree with the principle that current and future generations should have equitable access to different types of capital and assets to meet their needs. However, not everyone agrees on what those needs are and what type of assets and capital are needed to what extent. 2.3.2 Types SF Approaches to Sustainable Development. Following are the important approaches to sustainable development. Eric Larson, 1998. 2.3.2.1 Traditional approach. Traditional approach to development focuses on economic well-being as the primary measure of progress. This approach relies on economic measures of well-being such as personal income, number of jobs, financial returns on assets, and/or gross national product. Using these measures, traditional approach emphasizes that each generation should have equitable access to manufactured capital, financial assets, and economic opportunities to meet their needs. Traditional approach to sustainable development and programs also expands this traditional understanding of well-being to include the social and environmental well-being of people. Sustainable development programs under this approach typically define progress and well-being in broad terms that include measures of the health of the environment, communities, and the people living there. The supporters of this approach argue that people need access to a healthy natural environment to meet their need for life support services and also to ensure their physical health and well-being. They emphasize the need to sustain natural assets to preserve life support services and the need to conserve natural resources that future generations will depend on for IIFE. They point to the finite quantity of our natural assets and argue that their depletion or degradation may lead to hardships for future generations or even the possible extinction of our species. Leidman and Anna, 1996, Dasgupta, 1996, Nelder, 1998, and Rees, 1996. 2.3.2. Social and Human Capital Approach, Leidman, 1996, Dasgupta, 1996, Nelder, 1998, and Rees, 1996, also emphasize the social well-being of communities, cultures, and individuals. To help ensure social well-being, current and future generations should have access to the wealth offered by communities, institutions, and traditions. Besides accumulating financial wealth, creating jobs, and building physical infrastructure, we also need to ensure that the social institutions, human capital that sustain our communities are also passed on to future generations. Some critics, Simon and Herman, 1984, of sustainable development emphasize the accumulation of human capital alone. They argue that human ingenuity and innovation will use technology and natural resources more wisely to provide for the needs of future generation. They believe the accumulation of human knowledge and technology will provide what is needed for the well-being of future generations and that we should not be concerned about the depletion of natural assets. Instead, they argue, we should ensure that we pass on accumulated human capital to future generations. At the core of this debate is a disagreement about what we mean by well-being and how much of each type of capital future generations will need. The definition of well-being and the needs of a generation are often contentious and hotly debated topics in sustainable development approaches and programs. These debates on such definitions are based on fundamental individual values, and resolution of these debates are unique to each community, region, and country. 2.3.2.3 International Approach. In Section 2.2 above, you might have noticed the environmental contexts and the ways in which the people have reacted through their movements, which showed the differences in their approach to the environmental issues and concerns. All these environmental approaches and movements have led to the United Nations Conference on Human Environment held in Stockholm in 1972, the outcome of which is famously known as Stockholm Declaration. In this conference, the concept of sustainable development had been given a wider interpretation. In Principle 21 of Stockholm Action Plan, it is mentioned that it should be obligatory for the human being to use its natural resources in that manner by which his future generation can also avail all those resources. And individual has to play an important role for the protection of the environment. Rajrapasal Haroi, 210. After the Stockholm Conference, in late 1970s, the Brundtland Committee published a report which states that due to negligence of the human beings, the environment has encountered so much destruction. Now, it is the time for the human beings to participate in the environment protection actions. IBID. In 1992, the Earth Summit was held in the Rio de Janeiro, which is popularly known as Rio Declaration. In this conference, many new aspects of sustainable development were identified and various principles such as the precautionary principle, intergenerational equity, Agenda 21, biodiversity, etc. were mentioned. In Rio Declaration and others, it has been discussed that due to high rate of population growth, the sustainable use of natural resources is not possible. IBID. International Conference on Population and Development, ICPD, held in Cairo in 1994 had articulated and integrated the population issues into the context of development, and more so for sustainable development, and prepared 10-year program of action, and its follow-up till 2000 had effectively informed the MDGs. It has, thus, been well recognized that without the interference of the individual it is not possible to protect the environment. Later, people's participation, with due recognition to their rights and responsibilities in different aspects of social and national development through participatory decision-making, has become important aspect of sustainable development. 2.3.3 Basic aspects and issues of approaches to sustainable development. Based on the above discussed approaches to sustainable development, we can now have a perspective of sustainable development. In the Indian context, Ministry of Environment and Forest, MOEF, Government of India, 2002, see http://n4.nic. In Divisions IGWSSD-doc4 consulbookpers.pdf, provides a perspective of sustainable development covering its different aspects presented below. 2.3.3.1 Poverty eradication and sustainable livelihoods. Poverty and degraded environment are closely interrelated, especially where people depend for their livelihoods primarily on the natural resource base of their immediate environment. Restoring natural systems and improving natural resource management practices at the grassroots level are central to a strategy to eliminate poverty. The survival needs of the poor force them to continue to further degrade an already degraded environment. Removal of poverty is, therefore, a prerequisite for protection of the environment. Poverty magnifies the problem of hunger and malnutrition. The problem is further compounded by the inequitable access of the poor to the food that is available. It is, therefore, necessary to strengthen the public distribution system to overcome this inequity. Diversion of common and marginal lands to economically useful purposes deprives the poor of a resource base which has traditionally met many of their sustenance needs. Market forces also lead to the elimination of crops which have traditionally been integral to the diet of the poor, thereby threatening food security and nutritional status. While conventional economic development leads to elimination of several traditional occupations, the process of sustainable development, guided by the need to protect and conserve the environment, leads to the creation of new jobs and opportunities for the reorientations of traditional skills to new occupations. Women, while continuing to perform their traditional dam-stick roles, are increasingly involved in earning livelihoods. In many poor households, they are often the principal or the sole breadwinners. A major thrust at the policy level is necessary to ensure equity and justice for them. Literacy and basic education are essential for enabling the poor to access the benefits offered by development initiatives and market opportunities. Basic education is, therefore, a precondition for sustainable development. A sizable proportion, about 60% according to some estimates, of the population is not integrated into the market economy. Ensuring the security of their livelihoods is an imperative for sustainable development. 2.3.3. To changing unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, with increasing purchasing power, wasteful consumption linked to market-driven consumerism is further stressing the resource base of developing countries. It is important to counter this through education and public awareness. In several areas, desirable limits and standards for consumption need to be established and applied through appropriate mechanisms, including education, incentives, and legislation. Several traditional practices that are sustainable and environment-friendly continue to be a regular part of the lives of people in developing countries. These need to be encouraged rather than replaced by more modern but unsustainable practices and technologies. Development decisions regarding technology and infrastructure are a major determinant of consumption patterns. It is, therefore, important to evaluate and make development decisions which structurally lead to a more sustainable society. Technologies exist through which substantial reduction in consumption of resources is possible. Efforts to identify, evaluate, introduce, and use these technologies must be made. Subsidies often lead to wasteful and unsustainable consumption by distorting the value of a resource. Our pricing mechanisms must, therefore, be evaluated from a sustainable development point of view. 2.3.3.3 Protecting and managing the natural resource base of economic and social development, the integration of agriculture with land and water management and with ecosystem conservation essential for both environmental sustainability and agricultural production. An environmental perspective must guide the evaluation of all development projects, recognizing the role of natural resources in local livelihoods. This recognition must be informed by a comprehensive understanding of the perceptions and opinions of local people about their stakes in the resource base. To ensure sustainability of the natural resource base, the recognition of all stakeholders in it and their roles in its protection and management is essential. There is a need to establish well-defined and enforceable rights, including custodial rights and security of tenure, and to ensure equal access to land, water, and other natural and biological resources. It should further be ensured that this applies, in particular, to indigenous communities, women, and other disadvantaged groups living in poverty. Water governance arrangements should protect ecosystems and preserve or restore the ecological integrity of all natural water bodies and their catchments. This will maintain the wide range of ecological services that healthy ecosystems provide and the livelihoods that depend upon them. Biomass is, and will continue for a long time to be, a major source of fuel and energy, especially for the rural poor. Recognizing this fact, appropriate mechanisms must be evolved to make such consumption of biomass sustainable through both resource management and the promotion of efficient and minimally polluting technologies, and also technologies which will progressively reduce the pressures on biomass, which cause environmental degradation. The traditional approaches to natural resource management, such as sacred groves and ponds, water harvesting and management systems, etc., should be revived by creating institutional mechanisms which recapture the ecological wisdom and the spirit of community management inherent in those systems. 2.3.3.4 Sustainable development in a globalizing world. Globalization, as it is taking place today, is increasing the divide between the rich and the poor. It has to be stayed so that it serves not only the commercial interests but also the social needs of development. Global business thrives on and, therefore, encourages and imposes high levels of homogeneity in consumer preferences. On the contrary, for development to be locally appropriate and sustainable, it must be guided by local considerations which lie in cultural diversity and traditions. Hence, recognition at the policy level of the significance of diversity and the need to preserve it is an important precondition for sustainable development. In an increasingly globalizing economy, for want of the appropriate skills, the developing countries are often at a disadvantage in negotiating and operating multilateral trade agreements. Regional cooperation for capacity building is, therefore, necessary to ensure their effective participation in all stages of multilateral trade. Globalization is driven by a vast, globally spread human resource engine involving millions of livelihoods. Their security is sometimes threatened by local events causing global distortions, e.g., the impact of the WTC attack on jobs in India, or in a wider context, sanctions against countries not conforming to international prescriptions in human rights or environment-related matters. Mechanisms to safeguard trade and livelihoods, especially in developing countries, must be evolved and negotiated to make globalization an effective vehicle of sustainable development. War and armed conflicts are a major threat to sustainable development. It is imperative to evolve effective mechanisms for mediation in such situations and to resolve contentious issues without compromising the larger developmental goals of the conflicting parties. 2.3.3.5 Health and Sustainable Development. Arna and health, in its broadest sense of physical, mental and spiritual well-being, is, to a great extent, dependent on the access of the citizen to a healthy environment. For a healthy, productive and fulfilling life, every individual should have the physical and economic access to a balanced diet, safe drinking water, clean air, sanitation, environmental hygiene, primary health care and education. Access to safe drinking water and a healthy environment should be a fundamental right of every citizen. Citizens of developing countries continue to be vulnerable to a double burden of diseases, traditional diseases such as malaria and cholera, caused by unsafe drinking water and lack of environmental hygiene, have not yet been controlled, and in addition, people are now falling prey to modern diseases such as cancer and AIDS, and stress-related disorders. Many of the widespread ailments among the poor in developing countries are occupation-related and are contracted in the course of work done to fulfill the consumption demands of the affluent, both within the country and outside. The strong relationship between health and the state of the environment in developing countries is becoming increasingly evident. This calls for greater emphasis on preventive and social medicine, and on research in both occupational health and epidemiology, because of this close link. There needs to be greater integration between the ministries of health and environment, and effective coordination and cooperation between them. Basic health and educational facilities in developing countries need to be strengthened. The public health services must give preventive health care equal emphasis as curative health care. People should be empowered through education and awareness to participate in managing preventive health care related to environmental sanitation and hygiene. Most developing countries are repositories of a rich tradition of natural resource-based health care. This is under threat, on the one hand, from modern mainstream medicine, and on the other, from the degradation of the natural resource base. Traditional medicine in combination with modern medicine must be promoted while ensuring conservation of the resource base and effective protection of intellectual property rights of traditional knowledge. Developing countries should also strive to strengthen the capacity of their healthcare systems to deliver basic health services and to reduce environment-related health risks by sharing of health awareness and medical expertise globally. 2.3.3.6 Means of implementation, effectiveness of every program of sustainable development depends upon its approach and the means of implementation. Following are the important of these means. Finance, Overseas Development Assistance, ODA, is designing. The commitment made by industrialized countries at the Earth Summit in Rio a decade ago remain largely unmet. This is a cause for concern which has been voiced by several developing countries. Industrialized countries must honor their ODA commitments. The new instruments and mechanisms, e.g. the Clean Development Mechanism, that are trying to replace ODA need to be examined closely for their implications for the developing countries. In view of the declining trend in ODA, developing countries must explore how they can finance their sustainable development efforts, such as by introducing a system of ecological taxation. Private investment cannot replace development aid as it will not reach sectors relevant for the poor. Such investments and other mechanisms can at best be additional to, not replacements, for development assistance. Conditions attached to financial assistance need to be rigorously scrutinized, and the assistance accepted only if the conditionalities are acceptable. Financial support for sustainable development programs must not be negatively influenced by political considerations external to the objectives of the assistance. Trade regimes, specifically WTO, are sometimes in conflict with sustainable development priorities. Imperatives of trade, the concerns related to environment and equity and social justice, however, need to be dealt with independently. Environmental and social clauses which are implicitly or explicitly part of international agreements must not be ceded selectively to erect trade barriers against developing countries. Developing countries will suffer a major trade disadvantage if the efforts to put in place globally acceptable process and production methods, PPMs, are successful. Instead, existing disparities between the trade regimes and multilateral environmental agreements such as those between trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIPS, REGME and the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, should be thoroughly addressed. Mechanisms to resolve such conflicts between multilateral agreements should be set up. Technology, developing countries need not follow the conventional path to development with regard to technology but must use to their advantage the cutting-edge technology options now available to leapfrog and put the tools of modern technology to use. Mechanisms must be put in place to make available to developing countries the latest technologies at reasonable cost. Technology transfer must be informed by an understanding of its implications in the social, economic and environmental contexts of the receiving societies. Technologies must be usable by and beneficial to local people. Where possible, existing local technologies must be upgraded and adapted to make them more efficient and useful. Such local adaptations should also lead to the upgradation of local technical skills. Local innovations and capacity building for developing and managing locally relevant and appropriate technologies must be encouraged and supported. Integrating highly sophisticated modern technology with traditional practices sometimes produces the most culturally suited and acceptable solutions, which also make them more viable. Science and education. The paramount importance of education in effecting social change is well recognized. Mainstream education must now be realigned to promote awareness, attitudes, concerns, and skills that will lead to sustainable development. Basic education, which promotes functional literacy, livelihood skills, understanding of the immediate environment, and values of responsible citizenship, is a precondition for sustainable development. Such education must be available to every child as a fundamental right, without discrimination on the basis of economic, class, geographical location, or cultural identity. Adequate resources and support for education for sustainable development are essential. An understanding must be promoted among key decision makers of the potential of education to promote sustainability, reduce poverty, train people for sustainable livelihoods, and catalyze necessary public support for sustainable development initiatives. The empowerment of women and girls must be supported by actions to improve their access to basic and higher education, training, and capacity building. The emphasis should be on gender mainstreaming. Greater capacity needs to be built in science and technology through improved collaboration among research institutions, the private sector, NGOs, and government. Collaborations and partnerships between and among scientists, government, and all stakeholders on scientific research and development and its widespread application NSCD to be improved. Population. With India's population crossing a billion in the year 2000, the National Population Policy announced in that year assumed special significance. Its change in focus from merely setting target population figures to achieving population control through greater attention to socio-economic issues such as child health and survival, illiteracy, empowerment of women, and increased participation by men in Planned Parenthood, gives it greater breadth and depth, thereby holding forth better promise of achieving its long-term objective of a stable population by mid-century. The official realization that Population is not merely about numbers but about the health and quality of life of people in general and women in particular must be reinforced and sustained by an informed debate to bring key population issues into ever-sharpening perspective at various levels of policymaking, from national and state legislatures to local government institutions. There is need for a better and more widespread understanding that the number of children desired by any couple depends on a large and complexly interrelated number of socio-economic and cultural factors, and that any policy action seeking to control population must seriously take all these variables into account. An important part of empowering women in matters pertaining to population is to explicitly recognize and respect their rights over their bodies and their reproductive behavior. This recognition must permeate society in general, and religious, judicial, and law enforcement institutions in particular. Through continual campaigning and dialogue, the pursuit of population control must not be allowed to compromise human rights and basic democratic principles as well. 2.3.3.7 Strengthening governance for sustainable development at the local, national, and international levels. Effective management of resources requires participation by all stakeholders at all levels. Local level. At the local level, strengthening democratic institutions generally leads to better and more sustained management of natural resources. To enhance effectiveness of people's participation in local governance, committees comprising both elected and executive members of local bodies and representatives of community groups must be formed. Appropriate capacity building would enable them to undertake local development activities according to community priorities, monitor project implementation, and manage community assets. Where the conditions for such community empowerment have already been created, as in India through the 73rd and 74th Amendments of its constitution. Effective implementation of the provisions should be ensured. All members of society are the stakeholders of sustainable development. Women make up half of this group. Affirmative action to ensure representation and power to women in local governance and appropriate capacity building are necessary to make them effective and equal partners in the development process. Social groups which have been traditionally discriminated against must also be represented in local governance and empowered to ensure that they become effective and mainstream partners in development. Children are a valuable asset of every society. It is the responsibility not only of the parents but also of the community to ensure that the children realize their potentials fully and are growing up in a healthy, enriching, and fulfilling environment. Ensuring the provision of such an environment is a major challenge of governance at the local level. The occupational, cultural, and economic heterogeneity of population is, on the whole, a major asset in making development sustainable. But there are times of crisis when the same heterogeneity can become the basis of conflict and social insecurity. It is imperative to evolve participatory mechanisms of governance involving citizen groups and local authorities which will provide effective means of conflict resolution. National level, sustainable development is achieved through optimizing gains from several variables rather than maximizing those from a single one. This requires government departments, by convention, sectorally organized to work together, or in some cases, as a single multidisciplinary authority. For this, joint planning, transparency, and coordination in implementation are required. The richness of skills available in society must be harnessed through partnerships involving institutions in civil society such as NGOs, community-based organizations, CBO, corporate, including private bodies, academic and research institutions, trade unions, etc., which must be made an integral part of planning and implementation for sustainable development. There is, on the one hand, a surfeit of laws, many of them outmoded and irrelevant. On the other HMD, effective enforcement is lacking. In respect of laws relevant to contemporary concerns and conducive to governance, this calls for a thorough review of laws, elimination of those which are outmoded, and simplification of the procedures for implementing those which are relevant. Internal reviews as well as learning from international experience should be the basis of identifying and filling gaps in existing laws. It must, however, be recognized that laws in themselves do not provide solutions unless there are mechanisms to effectively enforce them. There are many traditional systems and practices whose value and validity needs to be recognized and brought into the mainstream of governmental development thinking and policy. Appropriate mechanisms for integrating them need to be created. Many policies were framed either before sustainable development became a major concern or in a sectoral perspective. These need to be reviewed from the point of view of sustainable development. All firm policies must be guided by considerations of sustainable development. Lacking policies should be identified and adequate policies compatible with the imperatives of sustainable development framed, taking into account successful examples of policies and initiatives in similar areas. 3. International level, there is both a need and a scope for regional and global cooperation in sustainable development. Some of the areas of common concern are marine and riparian issues, transboundary environmental impacts, management of bioresources, technology sharing and sharing of sustainable development experiences. Efforts must be made especially by developing countries to work towards synergizing experiences and raising shared regional concerns as a strong, united front in international forums. Mechanisms must be put in place to facilitate such international exchange of domestic and global experiences in sustainable development. There must be mechanisms for monitoring the compliance of countries to their obligations under various environmental agreements. Currently, there is a multiplicity of institutions with fragmented responsibilities. A better governance regime is required to ensure cooperation and compliance. 2.4 Strategy for Sustainable Development Aspects and Challenges. In this section, we will discuss the need, concept, components, principles, lenses, and criticisms of a strategy for sustainable development. 2.4.1 Need for a strategy for sustainable development. Achieving sustainable development will require deep structural changes and new ways of working in all areas of economic, environmental, social, and political life. This will include promoting proper economic growth and reforming fiscal policies which negatively affect the poor or cause environmental damage. In the long term, countries will have to ensure that their net wealth, including natural, man-made, and human capital, remains constant or increases. This will require ensuring that market prices reflect the full social and environmental costs of production and consumption. Issues of inequity and inequality of access to assets and resources need to be confronted. For example, it may be necessary to reform land tenure policies so as to increase access to the disadvantaged and marginalized groups. Equally, it may be important to strengthen social capital and formal safety nets to cope with both external and domestic shocks. OECD 2001. Sustainable development has important political, institutional, and capacity implications. At the national and local level, it requires cross-sectoral and participatory institutions and integrating mechanisms to engage governments, civil society, and the private sector in developing shared visions, planning, and decision-making. Governments, corporations, development, and cooperative agencies will also need to be more open and accountable for their actions. Innovation and investment in actions which promote sustainable development should be encouraged. More generally, economic planning and policy making will have to become more participatory, prudent, and transparent, as well as more long-term oriented, so as to respect the interests of future generations. IBID. 2.4.1.1 Need for structural changes, difficulties in introducing changes. There are many technical and political difficulties in integrating social, economic, and environmental objectives and inadequately addressing the intergenerational dimension of sustainable development. In general, there is little documented experience in most countries of developing such mechanisms, and there are no tried and tested methodologies integrating and making trade-offs between sustainable development objectives also requires strong legislative and judicial systems. These are often very weak in developing countries. IBID. Different challenges need to be addressed at different levels. Some of the challenges to sustainable development need to be addressed at the global level, e.g. climate change and ozone depletion. Some need to be addressed at the national level, e.g. economic, fiscal and trade policy or legislative changes, and some can only be addressed at the local level. The impacts of decisions taken at different levels need to be looked into in an integrated and coherent way. Their consequences and implications across different sectors and for different interest groups must be considered explicitly. IBID. Strategies. There can be conflicts between global, national, and local sustainable development priorities, especially in the short term. But there can also be complementarities. For example, the conservation of global biodiversity requires the preservation of habitats, while the need to feed growing populations may encourage their conversion to apiculture. However, for long-term sustainability, preservation of habitats for essential ecosystem services such as crop pollination, flood control, and water purification ultimately benefits agricultural production. Similarly, improved energy efficiency leading to reduced local air pollution has important health benefits at the local level. In addition to reductions in Greenhouse gas emissions. Often, there are costs involved in establishing or harnessing institutions and processes to move towards sustainable development, e.g., regular foray for participation, time and effort to engage in the process, mechanisms for collecting information and monitoring sustainable development indicators. These costs can be high in the short term, particularly for developing countries and poor groups. But the costs of taking no action are likely to be much greater. All these issues need to be taken into account in steering a track towards sustainable development. They cannot be effectively dealt with on an ad hoc or piecemeal basis. They require a strategic approach. BID. 2.4.2 Concept of Sustainable Development Strategy. What being strategic means? Being strategic implies setting goals and identifying means of achieving them. This further implies adopting an approach which has an underlying vision, is based on solid evidence, sets of priorities, goals and direction, and sets out the main tactics for achieving them. In relation to sustainable development, being strategic requires a comprehensive understanding of the concept of sustainable development and its implications, but not necessarily a comprehensive set of actions, at least at any one time. A strategic approach to sustainable development implies new ways of thinking and working so as to move OECD 2001 from developing and implementing fixed plans, ideas and solutions towards operating an adaptive system that can continuously improve governance to promote coherence between responses to different challenges, from a view that it is the state alone which is responsible for development towards one that sees responsibility with society as a whole. From centralized and controlled decision-making towards sharing results and opportunities, transparent negotiation, cooperation and concerted action. From a focus on outputs, e.g. projects and laws, towards a focus on outcomes, e.g. impacts of projects and legal changes. From sectoral towards integrated planning. From a dependence on external assistance towards domestically driven and financed development, towards a process which can accommodate monitoring, learning and improvement. Such an approach will assist countries in participating more effectively in international affairs, providing opportunities to consider the adverse social and environmental effects of globalization and identifying ways in which they can reap its benefits. It should also enable improved dialogue with foreign governments, corporations, and NGOs to negotiate new ways of working towards and supporting sustainable development. Sustainable development strategy. It is a coordinated set of participatory and continuously improving processes of analysis, debate, capacity strengthening, planning, and investment, which integrates the economic, social, and environmental objectives of society, seeking trade-offs where this is not possible. OECD 2000. It offers a set of principles. These encompass a set of desirable processes and outcomes which, taken together, are likely to help ensure success of strategies for sustainable development. The principles emphasize local ownership of the strategy process, effective participation from all levels, and high-level commitment. They point to the importance of convergence and coherence between different planning frameworks, integrated analysis, and capacity development. An effective strategy for sustainable development brings together the aspirations and capacity of government, civil society, and the private sector to create a vision for the future and to work tactically and progressively towards it. It identifies and builds on what works, improves integration between approaches, and provides a framework for making choices where integration is not possible. Focusing on what is realistically achievable, an effective strategy will benefit from comprehensive understanding, but will not be paralyzed by planning overly comprehensive actions on my fronts at once. As a process of practical institutional change aimed primarily at mainstreaming sustainability concerns, the strategy is likely to be focused on only a few priority objectives. A strategy for sustainable development will rarely imply initiating a completely new or standalone strategic planning project. Rather, a number of initiatives taken together could meet the definition and the principles. Bringing existing initiatives closer to an effective strategy for sustainable development might involve complementing them with a broad umbrella, a vision and set of coordinated mechanisms and processes to improve their complementarity, smooth out inconsistencies, and fill gaps when needed. In practice, many countries have taken the approach of building on whichever strategy models have been found useful. These include development plans, poverty reduction strategies, or action plans, national green plans, decentralized planning and consultation processes, or the national exercises that have proliferated over the last decades, connected to international agreements. In some countries, alternative approaches have been developed by civil society organizations. In recognition of this broad range of starting points, this guidance emphasizes that the label does not matter. What is important is a consistent application of the underlying principles that will be discussed under subsection 2.4.4. 2.4.3 Components of Sustainable Development Strategy. Depending on the circumstances, a sustainable development strategy may be viewed as a system comprising the following components: OECD, 2001. Regular multi-stakeholder forum and means for negotiation at national and decentralized levels, with links between them. A shared vision and set of broad strategic objectives. A set of mechanisms to pursue those objectives in ways that can adapt to change, notably an information system, communication capabilities, analytical processes, international engagement, and coordinated means for policy integration and budgeting, monitoring, and accountability. Principles and standards to be adopted by sectors and stakeholders through legislation, voluntary action, market-based instruments, etc. Pilot activities to generate learning and ownership. A secretariat or other facility with authority for coordinating different mechanisms, a mandate for all the above from a high-level, central authority such as the Prime Minister's Office and, to the extent possible, from citizens and business organizations. 2.4.4 Key Principles for Strategies for Sustainable Development. There cannot be hard and fast strategies that can be uniformly applied for sustainable development in all circumstances. Different national circumstances and priorities call for varied approaches to strategic planning. But consultations with developing countries during the dialogues and wider international experience, including the UN regional consultative workshops on sustainable development, have shown that there are many common features of good practice. These common features point to a set of principles underpinning effective strategies for sustainable development. These principles are as follows, which have universal relevance and may be applied to developed as well as developing countries. OECD, 2001. People-centered approach. An effective strategy should follow a people-centered approach, ensuring long-term beneficial impacts on the poor, the disadvantaged, and the marginalized groups. Consensus on long-term vision. Strategic planning frameworks are more likely to be successful when they are based on a long-term vision with a clear time frame upon which stakeholders agree. At the same time, they need to include ways of dealing with short and medium-term necessities and change. A long-term vision needs to have the commitment of all political parties so that an incoming government will not view a particular strategy as representing only the views or policies of its predecessor. Comprehensive and integrated objectives. Strategies should seek to integrate, where possible, economic, social, and environmental objectives. But, where integration cannot be achieved, trade-offs need to be negotiated. The entitlements and possible needs of future generations must be factored into this process, targeted with clear budgetary priorities. A sustainable development strategy must be fully integrated in existing budget processes to ensure that plans have the financial resources to achieve their objectives, and do not represent mere wish lists. Conversely, the formulation of budgets must be informed by a clear identification of priorities. Capacity constraints and time limitations will have an impact on the extent to which the intended outcomes are achieved. Targets need to be challenging but realistic in relation to these constraints. Based on comprehensive and reliable analysis, identification of priorities must be based on a comprehensive analysis of the present situation, forecasted trends and risks, and the links between local, national, and global challenges. External pressures on a country, such as those resulting from globalization or the impacts of global climate change, need to be factored in this analysis. Such analysis requires credible and reliable information on changing environmental, social, and economic conditions, pressures and responses, and their correlations with strategy objectives and indicators. Local capacities for analysis and existing information should be fully used, and different perceptions among stakeholders should be reflected. In corporate monitoring, learning and continuous improvement, monitoring and evaluation needs to be based on clear indicators and built into strategies to steer processes, track progress, distill and capture lessons, and signal when a change of direction is necessary. Country-led and nationally owned, past strategies have often resulted from external pressure and development agency requirements. It is essential that countries take the lead and initiative in developing their own strategies if they are to be enduring. High-level commitment of government and influential lead institutions. Such commitment on a long-term basis is essential if policy and institutional changes are to occur. Financial resources are to be committed and for there to be clear responsibility for implementation, building on existing processes and strategies. A strategy for sustainable development should not be thought of as a new planning process, but instead build on what already exists in the country, thus enabling convergence, complementarity, and coherence between different planning frameworks and policies. This requires good management to ensure coordination of mechanisms and processes, and to identify and resolve potential conflicts. The latter may require an independent and neutral third party to act as a facilitator. The roles, responsibilities, and relationships between the different key participants in strategy processes must be clarified at the earliest. Effective participation at different levels. Broad participation helps to open up the debate to new ideas and sources of information, exposes issues that need to be addressed, enables problems, needs and preferences to be expressed, identifies the capabilities required to address them, and develops a consensus on the need for action that leads to better implementation. Central government must be involved in providing leadership, shaping incentive structures, and allocating financial resources, but multi-stakeholder processes are also required. These should involve decentralized authorities, the private sector, and civil society, as well as marginalized groups. This requires good communication and information mechanisms with a premium placed on transparency and accountability. Link national and local levels. Strategies should be two-way iterative processes within and between national and decentralized levels. The main strategic principles and directions should be set at the central level. Here, economic, fiscal and trade, policy, legislative changes, international affairs and external relations, etc., are key responsibilities. But detailed planning, implementation and monitoring would be undertaken at a decentralized level, with appropriate transfer of resources and authority, develop and build on existing capacity. At the outset of a strategy process, it is important to assess the political, institutional, human, scientific and financial capacity of potential state, market and civil society participants. Where needed, provision should be made to develop the necessary capacity as part of the strategy process. A strategy should optimize local skills and capacity both within and outside government. Consider all requirements for effective participation in strategies. These requirements will depend on the scope and goals of the strategy and the likely participants, as well as on political and social circumstances. In general, these needs and requirements include the following: appropriate participatory methods for appraising needs and possibilities, dialogue, ranking solutions, forming partnerships, resolving conflicts, and reaching agreement on the way ahead. A proper understanding of all those with a legitimate interest in the strategy, and a considered and concrete approach to include the more vulnerable and disenfranchised among them, catalysts for participation, e.g., NGOs and local authorities to start participation, and to link decisions that need to be taken centrally with those appropriate to more local level, specific activities and events around which to focus participation, a step-by-step approach, i.e., start modestly, building on existing participation systems, and build up, then deepen and focus participation with each iteration of processes, adequate resources, skills and time. Effective participation tends to start slowly and requires early investment. It becomes more cost-effective with time. If there are learning environments, e.g., policies, laws and institutions that encourage, support, manage and reward participation in the planning development process, including specially formulated groups where appropriate institutions do not exist, and which allow participants and professionals to test approaches, then these requirements will be more likely to be met. Countries in peace with democratic systems, freedom of speech and the rule of law will, however, be in a better position to translate the above-mentioned principles into practice. Many of these principles represent good development practice and may be in practice at the project level. But putting them into practice in strategic planning and policy processes remains a challenge. Many past strategic planning processes such as National Environmental Action Plans, NEPs, and National Conservation Strategies NCSs did not have a lasting impact in terms of moving a country towards a more sustainable development path because they were not and sometimes did not aim to be integrated into a country's mainstream strategic planning systems. International commitments to eliminate poverty through sustainable development offer a major new opportunity to achieve progress in integrating all the components of sustainable development into countries' strategic planning processes. These are the principles towards which strategies should aspire. They are all important, and no order of priority is implied. They do not represent a checklist of criteria to be met but encompass a set of desirable processes and outcomes which also allow for sectoral and local differences in their application. The globally accepted and popular approach is overall development of peoples with emphasis on sustainable development, which encompasses all the above discussed approaches, giving more recognition to aspects of human development. 44.1 Principles of Strategic Approach to Sustainable Development, exemplary from a case. Glenn M. Weiser and Daniel B. Magro, Jr. have identified 15 principles that they believe have the most direct relevance to a strategic approach to international chemicals management, SAICM. Out of them, 14 can be considered as equally applicable to a strategic approach in any other sector as well, and are generalized as follows. 1. Principle of intergenerational equity. According to this principle, the present generation has a right to use and enjoy the resources the earth, but is under an obligation to take into account the long-term impacts of its activities on sustaining the resource base and the global environment for the benefit of future generations of humankind. 2. Principle of precaution. It is a decision-making tool for taking action in response to threats of serious or irreversible damage to human health and/or the environment when full scientific information is not available. 3. Principle of proportionality. According to this, the measures taken to protect human health and the environment should be proportional to the chosen level of protection. taking into account technical and economic feasibility and other relevant factors as well as a country's chosen level of protection. 4. Principle of life cycle approach. It is a tool for conducting a systematic, cradle to grave, or cradle to cradle, analysis to estimate the environmental consequences of alternative materials, designs, manufacturing processes, product use patterns, and end-of-life alternatives. 5. Principle of prevention. This principle deals with how any harm to human health and the environment can be averted, recognizing that the economic and social costs of avoiding damage and injury are nearly always less than the costs of repair, treatment, or compensation after they happen. 6. Principle of substitution. According to this, when a chemical product may cause risks to human health or the environment, it should be avoided if products or processes that are less dangerous can reasonably be used instead. 7. Principle of internalization of costs. Pays principle. The use of market and or regulatory instruments to ensure that persons who are responsible for pollution or for production or processes that may ultimately lead to pollution bear the full environmental and social costs of their activities, and that those costs are reflected in the market price for goods and services. 8. Principle of public participation. It includes unrestricted public access to environmental information with only limited, explicitly defined exceptions, the right of the public to participate in environmental decision-making processes and have its input taken into account, and opportunities for redress when authorities fail to comply with their duties to provide access to information or decision-making. 9. Principle of right to know. It is a specific aspect of the public's access to environmental information, the concept that the public has the right to know information regarding the risks to human and environmental health from chemicals, including chemical accidents, manufacturing, use and disposal. 10. Principle of confidential business information. According to this, information provided by a business entity cannot normally be disclosed by the government to a third party, including, sometimes, other governments or governmental departments. 11. Principle of good governance. This principle states that transparent, accountable, and honest government is an important component of sustainable development, and, more particularly, an essential element for the prevention and punishment of illegal traffic in hazardous wastes and restricted and banned chemicals. 12. Principle of cooperation among states, including common but differentiated responsibilities. According to this, in order to effect collective, global action to achieve sustainable development, different standards, delayed compliance timetables, or less stringent treaty commitments may be appropriate for different countries at different stages of development, and that developed countries have a special obligation with respect to providing technical and financial assistance to developing countries and the countries with their economies in transition. 13. Principle of partnerships. This principle states that there should be collaborations among stakeholders such as the governments, NGOs, industry groups, business organizations and NGOs that allow each partner to leverage its unique set of expertise, efficiencies and networks to achieve a more productive and sustainable outcome than if pursued alone. 13. Principle of liability. This principle holds a public or private entity responsible for providing compensation for an injury after it has occurred due to its strategic failure. 2.4.5 Specific roles of individual, organization, and government. We have discussed the approaches and strategies for achieving sustainable development. In this context, we will now discuss the specific role of agencies, individuals, organizations, and government. Following are some specific ways in which each of these agencies can play their active role in achieving sustainable development. Individual and family level. Earth can fulfill needs of all but not the greed of anyone. Our attitude play an important role in achieving sustainable development at individual and family level, which include the following: less wastage of energy, less wastage of food, limiting our needs Alternative use of resources, e.g., plastic table instead of wooden or steel table chair. Maximum use of solar APD wind energy. Less wastage of water. Environment-friendly food habits. Coordination and cooperation among families and individuals. 2. Society level. At this level, the following things determine crucial role of society. Social customs and celebrations of family functions should be environment social discipline. Community cleanliness civic sense, communal harmony. 3. Industrial corporate level. At this level, the specific roles include the following: control on excessive use of natural resources like energy, fuel, water, etc., control on various types of pollution, air, water, land, noise, use of alternative materials for more scarce and fun resources, use of eco-friendly material, and soft technology. 4. Government level. Government roles include proper implementation of the policies, proper planning of manpower, industries, resources and development, reducing wastage, strict pollution control measures, cooperation and coordination among various stakeholders. 2.4.6 Key challenges to sustainable development strategy in developing countries. Whatever be the strategy, challenges are bound to exist. However, in the context of sustainable development strategy in developing countries, the key challenges include the following. Extreme poverty still ravages the lives of 1 out of every 5 persons in the developing world. The social ills associated with poverty, including disease, illiteracy, family breakdown, crime, use of narcotic drugs, etc., are on the rise in many countries. Political instability, sometimes leading to violent conflicts, hinders socio-economic progress in many countries and regions. Growing inequality of income both within and between countries, as well as the marginalization of ethnic and other minorities, contribute to this instability. Environmental deterioration continues to increase. Natural resource depletion, soil erosion, loss of forests, habitats, biodiversity, and depletion of fish stocks, and pollution are clearly evident in most countries, placing growing strain on the quality of water, soil, and air. Current patterns of production and consumption and global climate change, among others, raise questions about the continued capacity of the Earth's natural resource base to feed and sustain a growing and increasingly urbanized population. Recent studies have revealed that the Earth's ecosystem and non-renewable natural resources declined by over 30% over the last 30 years, while demands on them have increased by 50%. Developing countries, and notably the least developed, are expected to be the most vulnerable to the impacts of global climate change. Although their current contribution to the problem is small, rapid population growth is expected to exacerbate these pressures. Although it is people's consumption levels that utter more are their mere numbers. Over 95% of the estimated increase of 2 billion people over the next 20 years will live in the developing world. Knowles and malaria are particularly serious diseases which corrode the productive capacity and social fabric of nations. In the worst affected countries, HIV has already had a profound impact on existing rates of infant, child, and maternal mortality. Nearly 500 million people suffer from acute malaria a year, of whom 1 million will die. Marginalization. Many countries are struggling under the combined weight of slow economic growth, a heavy external debt burden, corruption, violent conflicts, and food insecurity. They also suffer from actions taken in the north such as trade protectionism and pollution causing global warming. As a result, they are increasingly marginalized from the global economy. 2.4.7 Criticisms of Sustainable Development. Following criticisms provide us an understanding of negative aspects or disagreements associated with sustainable development. Vague and ill-defined. Some critics point out that sustainable development itself is vague and ill-defined. This criticism arises because much of sustainable development cannot be precisely measured, traditional understanding of progress have focused on well-defined economic quantities such as personal income, financial, Ritu-NS, gross national product, or the number of jobs. As long as these measures were increasing, well-being was assumed to be progressing in a favorable direction. Liebman and Anna, 996. Sustainable development attempts to look beyond these conventional measures of progress and considers our needs for natural, social, and human capital. These aspects of progress are less precise and harder to quantify, especially in economic terms. Aspects of our social, community, and environmental well-being do not always lend themselves to precise or measurable definitions. Even if they cannot be precisely measured or quantified, these are still important aspects of progress for many sustainability programs. Erik Larsen. 1998. Under growth. For some people, the word sustainable development conjures up images of no growth, maintaining the status quo, no change, or a return to primitive days. This interpretation is especially popular for groups who take a narrow view of progress and favor only one type of capital or asset over all others. For example, in some debates over sustainable development, one side may want to sustain only our economy and manufactured capital as a way to protect jobs and income for future generations. On the other side of this, sometimes harsh and adversarial debate, opponents advocate sustaining only natural capital as a way to protect environmental health, natural resources, and the life support services for future generations. Each side in this battle tries to protect one form of capital or asset while ignoring other assets. To conclude, these adversaries become preoccupied with protecting their personal, favorite type of capital and lose sight that sustainable development includes a broad view of all types of assets and capital, not just one. These arguments pitting one form of capital against another maintain the confrontational status quo and prevent meaningful change or progress. Communities and regions that are able to constructively and respectfully discuss the need for all types of capital, manufactured capital, financial assets, natural capital, human capital, and social capital are the most successful in implementing sustainable development programs and achieving their own definition or vision of progress. IBID.K Way Ahead. Sustainable development proposes that each generation has the same opportunity to meet its needs. We can do this by ensuring that each generation has access to the same capital and assets as our generation. We need to provide them with natural capital, human capital, and manufactured capital so that they can provide for all types of well-being including economic, environmental, and community health. Many sustainable development programs started over the past 10 years provide numerous examples that we can draw upon. We can initiate indicator programs at the community level to measure all aspects of well-being in our communities. We can measure the sustainable output of our economy in order to keep track of how we are depleting our non-renewable resources. We can assess the full costs of development projects to ensure that the social and environmental costs are consistent with our development goals. A sustainability program will be most successful if it begins at the community level and involves the people and interest groups most interested in the progress of their communities. Successful programs are able to move beyond adversarial and confrontational relationships that have pitted the economy and environment against each other. Communities that are able to respectfully discuss all types of capital assets and include a wide range of participants are the most successful at implementing sustainable development programs. 2.5 Summary. Sustainable development is a matter of concern for all individuals, communities, societies, nations, and the international community. While it became significant in the light of Industrial Revolution, gradually it acquired everlasting currency. The approaches and strategy to promote sustainable development will vary from context to context. and its broad contours remain the same with minor differences depend upon degree of concern at given time and place. Broadly, the principles of sustainable development strategy will have universal applicability with due regard to minor variations and exceptions, research-specific situation. Therefore, we have focused on all these aspects in this unit. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.